Make it look like an accident. He's poisoning my daughter against me. Those were my father's words to a stranger on the phone on what should have been the happiest day of my year, my 5th wedding anniversary. That night, alone in our bedroom while my husband slept peacefully beside me, I stared at my anniversary ring, the one he'd given me that morning with such love in his eyes, and I realized that the man who taught me to ride a bike had just ordered someone to kill the man I chose to spend my life with. Dad had no idea that I'd been recording every conversation for weeks, trying to understand why my husband felt like someone was watching us, why he'd started checking our car for tracking devices, why he'd stopped going to his favorite coffee shop. The same hands that used to braid my hair were now planning to destroy the love that made me whole, and as I touched my wedding ring in the darkness, I knew that protecting my marriage would mean betraying my blood. My name is Jessica, and this is the story of how an anniversary ring and a phone recording taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones willing to destroy us to keep us. Before I tell you how an anniversary ring and FBI recording changed our family forever, subscribe and share the story with someone who knows what it's like to choose love over blood. And please, comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I love connecting with wives and daughters from all over the world. What happened that night taught us that sometimes protecting love requires the hardest courage of all. The recording is 4 minutes and 37 seconds long, and I've listened to it 23 times now, my hands shaking more with each replay. I sit at our kitchen table, the same table where my husband and I had shared anniversary pancakes just 12 hours ago, where he'd slipped this ring onto my finger with tears in his eyes, promising me 5 more years and 50 more after that. Now the ring sits beside my phone like evidence in a crime I never thought I'd have to solve, catching the afternoon light that streams through the windows he installed last spring because he noticed I loved morning coffee and natural sunlight. The voice on the recording is my father's, but it sounds like a stranger speaking through his throat, cold and calculated in a way that makes my stomach twist with the kind of nausea you get when you realize the ground you've been standing on was never solid at all. How did my father become a stranger? How does a man who used to check for monsters under my bed become the monster himself? I press play again, and there it is. The target is David Parker, 29 years old, works at Patterson Construction, drives a blue Honda Civic. Target. He called my husband a target, like David was something to be eliminated rather than the man who remembers my coffee order, who still opens car doors for me, who cried when we adopted our rescue dog because he said our family finally felt complete. The stranger continues. He leaves for work at 7:15 every morning, takes Route 34 through Miller's Canyon. That stretch of road has some dangerous curves. I know those curves. David and I drive them every weekend to visit his grandmother, the sweet woman who welcomed me into their family with homemade apple pies and stories about David's childhood, the woman who calls me her granddaughter-in-law and means it with every fiber of her being. My father knows those curves too, because he's the one who taught me to drive them when I was 16, his patient voice guiding me through each turn, his hand steady on mine when I gripped the wheel too tight. The recording crackles with static, and I hear him say, "Make it clean." She can't know it was anything but an accident. My daughter loved her mother too much to ever forgive me if she knew. Loved her mother too much. Past tense. As if my capacity for love was something he'd measured and found threatening, as if the heart he helped create was now too big for his control. I think about my mother's funeral 3 years ago, how David held me through every tear, how he slept in the chair beside our bed for weeks because I was afraid of the dark, how he learned to make her lasagna recipe because it was the only thing that brought me comfort. Is that when it started? When my father saw that someone else could dry my tears better than he could? The voice of the other man is harder to make out, muffled and careful, but I catch fragments. 25,000, and next week, and clean job, no questions. $25,000. That's what my husband's life is worth to my father. That's less than we spent on our wedding, less than the truck David bought last year, less than the down payment on the house we're saving for. The man who walked me down the aisle, who toasted to our happiness, who looked me in the eyes and promised that David would take care of me the way he always had, decided my happiness was worth $25,000 in destruction. I set the phone down and stare at my ring again, the simple band of gold that represents 5 years of love my father wants to erase. David doesn't know I'm listening to this. He's at work right now, probably whistling while he reviews blueprints, Maybe planning some small surprise for tonight because he still believes anniversaries should be celebrated every day. He has no idea that his morning commute has become a hunting ground, that the man who shook his hand at our engagement party has turned him into prey. How did my father become a stranger? Maybe he always was one, and I just loved him too much to see it. I was 6 when Dad first called me his little shadow, following him everywhere around our house in Cedar Falls, mimicking his walk, copying the way he stirred his morning coffee. Back then, Richard Parker was my hero in work boots and flannel shirts, the man who could fix anything with duct tape and determination, who taught me that crying was okay but giving up never was. Saturday mornings meant hardware store adventures, where I'd ride in the shopping cart while he explained the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, his voice patient and warm, treating my questions like they mattered more than anything else in the world. He built me a tree house that summer, every nail hammered with precision, every board measured twice because my princess deserves perfection. And I remember sitting up there feeling like the luckiest girl alive because I had a father who could create magic with his hands. Sunday afternoons were reserved for fishing at Miller's Pond, just the two of us with a cooler full of sandwiches Mom packed, and he'd bait my hook because worms made me squeamish, then celebrate every tiny fish I caught like I'd landed a prize marlin. Those were the days when his laughter was genuine, when his protectiveness felt like love instead of control, when being Daddy's girl meant safety instead of ownership. He taught me to change a tire when I turned 16, his hands guiding mine on the wrench, showing me how to be independent while promising he'd always be there if I needed him. A Parker woman should never need a man to rescue her, he used to say, but she should never be too proud to accept help when it's offered with love. The irony tastes bitter now, knowing that the same man who taught me self-reliance would later try to eliminate the person who supported my independence. I was 18 when I left for college, and I remember him crying in the driveway, not the quiet tears men try to hide, but actual sobs that shook his shoulders while he held me tight. "You'll always be my little girl," he whispered into my hair, "no matter how big you get or how far you go." I thought it was beautiful then, this devotion, this love that seemed unbreakable. I had no idea it was actually a chain. The phone call started immediately, every day at first, then twice a day, wanting to know about my classes, my friends, whether I was eating enough, sleeping enough, making good choices. When I mentioned boys, his voice would tighten just slightly, a shift so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining it. "Just remember," he'd say, "no one will ever love you the way your family does. Boys your age don't understand what real commitment looks like." He visited campus monthly, always with some excuse, bringing homemade cookies, checking my car, wanting to take me to dinner at the nice restaurant downtown. Other girls envied my devoted father, wished their dads cared half as much, and I felt proud, special, chosen. I didn't recognize the interviews disguised as conversations, the way he cataloged every detail about my social life, mental mapping the people who might threaten his position as the most important man in my world. Looking back, I can see the moment everything shifted, though I missed it completely at the time. Junior year, spring semester, I called home bubbling with excitement about a boy named David who'd asked me to study group, then coffee, then an actual date. The silence stretched, so long I thought the call had dropped. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried a chill I'd never heard before. "Be careful, Jessica. Young men today aren't like they used to be. They'll tell you anything to get what they want." That was the beginning of the end of Daddy's little girl, though it would take me years to understand that the man who taught me my worth had decided to become the person who would try to destroy it. I was 6 when Dad first called me his little shadow, following him everywhere around our house in Cedar Falls, mimicking his walk, copying the way he stirred his morning coffee. Back then, Richard Parker was my hero in work boots and flannel shirts, the man who could fix anything with duct tape and determination, who taught me that crying was okay but giving up never was. Saturday mornings meant hardware store adventures, where I'd ride in the shopping cart while he explained the difference between Phillips and flathead screwdrivers, his voice patient and warm, treating my questions like they mattered more than anything else in the world. He built me a tree house that summer, every nail hammered with precision, every board measured twice because my princess deserves perfection. And I remember sitting up there feeling like the luckiest girl alive because I had a father who could create magic with his hands. Sunday afternoons were reserved for fishing at Miller's Pond, just the two of us with a cooler full of sandwiches Mom packed, and he'd bait my hook because worms made me squeamish, then celebrate every tiny fish I caught like I'd landed a prize marlin. Those were the days when his laughter was genuine, when his protectiveness felt like love instead of control, when being Daddy's girl meant safety instead of ownership. He taught me to change a tire when I turned 16, his hands guiding mine on the wrench, showing me how to be independent while promising he'd always be there if I needed him. A Parker woman should never need a man to rescue her, he used to say, but she should never be too proud to accept help when it's offered with love. The irony tastes bitter now, knowing that the same man who taught me self-reliance would later try to eliminate the person who supported my independence. I was 18 when I left for college, and I remember him crying in the driveway, not the quiet tears men try to hide, but actual sobs that shook his shoulders while he held me tight. "You'll always be my little girl," he whispered into my hair, "no matter how big you get or how far you go." I thought it was beautiful then, this devotion, this love that seemed unbreakable. I had no idea it was actually a chain. The phone call started immediately, every day at first, then twice a day, wanting to know about my classes, my friends, whether I was eating enough, sleeping enough, making good choices. When I mentioned boys, his voice would tighten just slightly, a shift so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining it. "Just remember," he'd say, "no one will ever love you the way your family does. Boys your age don't understand what real commitment looks like." He visited campus monthly, always with some excuse, bringing homemade cookies, checking my car, wanting to take me to dinner at the nice restaurant downtown. Other girls envied my devoted father, wished their dads cared half as much, and I felt proud, special, chosen. I didn't recognize the interviews disguised as conversations, the way he cataloged every detail about my social life, mental mapping the people who might threaten his position as the most important man in my world. Looking back, I can see the moment everything shifted, though I missed it completely at the time. Junior year, spring semester, I called home bubbling with excitement about a boy named David who'd asked me to study group, then coffee, then an actual date. The silence stretched, so long I thought the call had dropped. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried a chill I'd never heard before. "Be careful, Jessica. Young men today aren't like they used to be. They'll tell you anything to get what they want." That was the beginning of the end of Daddy's little girl, though it would take me years to understand that the man who taught me my worth had decided to become the person who would try to destroy it. Mom was folding laundry in the basement when I found her that Christmas morning, 3 months after bringing David home for the first time. Her movements mechanical and precise in a way that suggested she was using the mundane task to avoid something bigger. The washer hummed in the background, a steady rhythm that had soundtracked countless conversations throughout my childhood, but this time the familiar noise felt ominous, like it was trying to drown out words she'd been holding back for years. I sat on the edge of the old couch where she used to read me bedtime stories, watching her shake out one of Dad's work shirts with more force than necessary, and something in her posture, the rigid set of her shoulders, the careful way she avoided meeting my eyes, told me this conversation had been inevitable since the moment I'd said David's name with love in my voice. "Mom, what's wrong with Dad?" I asked finally, unable to ignore the tension that had been building in our house like pressure before a storm, the way conversation stopped when I entered rooms, the way my father's smiles felt increasingly brittle around the edges. She dropped the shirt back into the basket and stood perfectly still for a moment, her back to me, hands gripping the edge of the folding table until her knuckles went white. When she turned around, I saw something in her face I'd never noticed before, exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind of weariness that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for one person to hold. "Your father," she said slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone walking through a minefield, "has always had trouble sharing the people he loves." The admission hung between us like a confession she'd been rehearsing for decades, and I realized that the tremor in her voice wasn't fear of what she was about to tell me, it was relief at finally being able to say it out loud. She moved to sit beside me on the couch, the same spot where she taught me to braid friendship bracelets and helped me practice spelling words. But now the familiar space felt charged with revelations I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "When we first got married," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon him down to the basement, He wanted to know where I was every minute of every day. Not because he didn't trust me, but because he couldn't bear the thought that I might be happy somewhere he couldn't see. I thought about my college years, the daily phone calls, the unexpected visits, the way my father had cataloged every detail of my social life with what I'd mistaken for caring interest. He used to follow me sometimes, Mom said, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. To the grocery store, to lunch with friends, always with some excuse about being in the neighborhood or needing to pick something up. It took me years to understand that it wasn't about not trusting me, it was about not trusting the world to return me to him unchanged. The washing machine clicked into its spin cycle, a violent churning that seemed to echo the turmoil building in my chest as I processed what she was really telling me. This wasn't just about David. This was about a pattern that had been repeating itself for 27 years, a cycle of control disguised as devotion that I was only now learning to recognize. "Your father can't let you be happy without him," she said finally, the words carrying the weight of a woman who'd spent decades learning to navigate love that felt more like ownership. "And David makes you happy in a way that has nothing to do with your father's approval. That terrifies him more than anything else in the world." I stared at my mother, really seeing her for perhaps the first time, recognizing the careful way she'd learned to move through our house, always anticipating his needs, always managing his emotions, always making herself smaller so he could feel bigger. How many times had she wanted to warn me and held back? How many red flags had she spotted that I'd been too blinded by daughterly love to see? "Mom, why didn't you tell me this before?" The question came out sharper than I intended, tinged with anger at years of protection I'd never asked for, but she met my gaze with the steady resolve of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since the day I was born. "Because I hoped you'd be different," she said simply. "I hoped that loving you might teach him how to let go." But watching him with David these past few months, seeing that look in his eyes that I recognized from my own experience, I realized that some people can't learn to love without owning. She reached over and took my hand, her fingers cold from the basement air but steady with purpose. "Your father loves you more than anything in this world, Jessica. But his love comes with conditions, and David represents the first condition you might not be willing to meet." The truth of her words settled into my bones like winter cold, and I understood finally that the man upstairs wasn't just struggling with his daughter growing up. He was fighting a war against anyone who might prove that his version of love wasn't the only one worth having. This was bigger than overprotectiveness, deeper than normal parental concern. This was about a man who'd built his entire identity around being the most important person in my world, and David's presence threatened the very foundation of who my father believed himself to be. Our apartment on Maple Street became a sanctuary David built one thoughtful gesture at a time, starting with the way he'd learned my morning routine within our first month of marriage, and began setting the coffee maker the night before, so I'd wake up to the smell of French roast and the quiet satisfaction of being understood without having to ask. He installed blackout curtains in our bedroom because I was a light sleeper, bought the expensive vanilla candles I loved but never splurged on for myself, and somehow always remembered to pick up the specific brand of yogurt I preferred, even when he was grabbing groceries after exhausting 12-hour shifts at the construction site. Sunday mornings meant pancakes from scratch using his grandmother's recipe, David standing at our tiny stove in nothing but pajama pants and an old college t-shirt, humming off-key while he flipped perfect golden circles that tasted like home should taste. I'd sit at our kitchen table, the one we'd found at a yard sale and refinished together, sanding away years of other people's memories to create something that was entirely ours, reading him sections from the newspaper while steam rose from our coffee cups and sunlight painted everything warm and possible. Those were the moments that made me understand why people write love songs and poetry about ordinary life, because there's something magical about sharing space with someone who makes your daily existence feel like a choice rather than a routine. David had this way of listening that made me feel like every story I told him was the most interesting thing he'd heard all day, even when I was complaining about difficult customers at the dental office where I worked or rambling about some documentary I'd watched while he was at work. He'd nod at all the right moments, ask questions that proved he was actually paying attention, and somehow always know when I needed advice versus when I just needed someone to hear me vent about the small frustrations that accumulated during normal weeks in normal lives. Tuesday evenings became our sacred time for trying new recipes together, usually disasters that ended with us ordering pizza and laughing about our culinary failures while we cleaned flour off every surface in our kitchen. David would put on classic rock and dance around our living room with the mop, singing Bruce Springsteen lyrics into the handle while I wiped down counters and marveled at how someone could make even household chores feel like celebration. We adopted Murphy from the animal shelter during our second year of marriage, a golden retriever mix with anxious eyes and a tail that never stopped wagging once he realized he was home. Watching David teach our dog basic commands with the same patience he showed me when I was learning to change the oil in my car made me fall in love with him all over again, because gentleness in a man who could rebuild engines and frame houses suggested depths of character I was still discovering. Friday nights meant movie marathons on our secondhand couch, David's arm around my shoulders while we argued good-naturedly about whether to watch his action movies or my romantic comedies, usually compromising on something neither of us particularly wanted to see, but enjoying the negotiation more than the actual film. I loved the weight of his hand in mine during scary parts, the way he'd absently play with my wedding ring while we watched, twisting the band around my finger like a worry stone that reminded him I was real and present and choosing to be there beside him. Saturday afternoons were for projects, David's methodical approach to improvement balancing my impulsive ideas about rearranging furniture or painting accent walls in colors that looked better in the store than they did on our living room. He never complained when I changed my mind halfway through painting the bathroom or decided the bookshelf looked better in the bedroom after he'd already mounted it in the hallway, just smiled and reached for his tools because making me happy was apparently worth the extra work. Our third anniversary, he surprised me with a weekend trip to the mountains. Not because we could particularly afford it, but because he'd noticed me looking stressed about work and thought I needed to remember what trees looked like without buildings framing them. We spent 2 days hiking trails that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with Pennsylvania autumns, David carrying our backpack and pointing out birds whose names he'd researched specifically for this trip because he knew I found wildlife fascinating even though I could barely tell a cardinal from a blue jay. It was during our 4th year that we started talking seriously about buying a house, spreading real estate listings across our kitchen table like we were planning a military campaign, debating the merits of extra bedrooms versus updated kitchens with the intensity of people who understood that these decisions would shape the next chapter of our shared story. David had opinions about foundation integrity and electrical systems, while I focused on natural light and neighborhood walkability, and somehow our different priorities complemented each other perfectly, creating a wish list that felt both practical and dreamlike. The ring catches morning light differently now, 5 years after David slipped it onto my finger with trembling hands outside the courthouse, where we decided to elope because planning a big wedding felt less important than simply being married to each other. It's a simple white gold band with a small diamond that isn't impressive by jewelry store standards, but David had worked overtime for 3 months to afford it, coming home exhausted and paint-splattered but grinning every time I asked why he'd been picking up extra shifts. "Just want to make sure I can give you everything you deserve," he'd say, kissing my forehead while I pretended not to notice the jewelry store receipt sticking out of his wallet, or the way he'd started researching diamond cuts during his lunch breaks. This morning, on our 5th anniversary, he presented me with a matching eternity band studded with tiny diamonds that spell out forever, in a script so delicate I had to hold it up to the light to read the inscription. 5 years down, he'd whispered against my ear while sliding it onto my finger beside the original ring. And about 60 more to go if you'll have me. The weight of both rings together feels substantial now, a physical reminder of promises made and kept, of small daily choices that accumulated into something worthy of celebration. I twist them around my finger while I work, a nervous habit David has started commenting on with gentle teasing, asking if I'm trying to wear the metal down to nothing or if I'm just making sure they're still there. The truth is, I do check sometimes, especially lately, running my thumb over the smooth surface of the bands when anxiety builds in my chest for reasons I can't quite articulate, when the feeling of being watched becomes too persistent to ignore. 2 weeks ago, David mentioned that he'd noticed the same silver sedan in our neighborhood 3 different times, always parked across from our apartment complex, always empty when he looked closer. "Probably nothing," he'd said, but his voice carried the kind of careful casualness that meant he was trying not to worry me while he worried plenty himself. Last week, he started varying his route to work, taking different streets each morning and checking his rearview mirror more often than usual, his jaw tight with concentration that had nothing to do with traffic. When I asked about it, he just shrugged and said construction season made the main roads unpredictable, but I caught him looking over his shoulder in parking lots and double-checking that our apartment door was locked before bed. Yesterday morning, while we were sharing coffee and planning our anniversary dinner, David reached across the table and covered my hand with his thumb automatically finding my rings and spinning them gently around my finger. "Jess, has your dad seemed different to you lately?" The question caught me off guard, partly because we rarely talked about my father anymore. Our relationship had grown increasingly strained since the wedding, his disapproval hanging over every family gathering like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. "Different how?" I'd asked, though something cold had started spreading through my stomach because David wasn't the type to ask leading questions without reason. "More interested in my schedule, maybe? The last few times we've talked, he's asked a lot of specific questions about my work, where I'm going, what projects I'm working on. Could be normal father-in-law curiosity, but—" He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. He was too kind to speak aloud. Now, sitting here with the recording playing through my phone, I understand that my rings represent everything my father wanted to destroy. 5 years of love he considered a threat to his ownership of my heart. These bands that symbolize partnership and mutual respect and daily choice to keep choosing each other, they're evidence of a relationship built on equality rather than control, love that doesn't require possession to prove its worth. David had asked my father for permission to marry me, an old-fashioned gesture that I'd found sweet at the time, but Dad's response had been tellingly lukewarm. "If that's what Jessica wants, I suppose I can't stop her." Not a blessing, not enthusiasm, just resigned acknowledgement that his little girl was making a choice that didn't center him for the first time in her life. I remember the conversation David had described afterward, how my father had spent more time explaining my childhood fears and insecurities than celebrating our engagement, as if he were handing over a list of weaknesses rather than giving his blessing to someone who loved his daughter enough to ask permission he didn't legally need. The ring feels heavier now, weighted with the knowledge that its presence on my finger has been a source of rage for someone who should have been celebrating the happiness it represents. 5 years of love he wanted to destroy. 5 years of marriage he'd been plotting to end. 5 years of watching his daughter choose someone else's hand to hold through life's difficulties and small joys. David's hand started shaking 3 weeks ago, just barely. A tremor so subtle I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching him try to thread a screw into our bathroom cabinet while I held the flashlight steady. Construction workers don't get nervous around power tools, but there he was, fumbling with equipment he'd used thousands of times before, his usual confidence replaced by something jittery and unfocused that made my stomach clench with worry I couldn't name. "Just tired," he'd said when I asked, but his smile felt forced, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. And that night I caught him standing at our bedroom window for nearly an hour, staring down at the parking lot with the kind of intensity usually reserved for reading blueprints or technical manuals. The coffee shop incident happened the following Tuesday, our usual morning routine disrupted when David suddenly grabbed my arm outside Brennan's cafe, his grip tight enough to leave marks, his eyes scanning the street with military precision that seemed completely out of proportion to our suburban neighborhood. "We should go somewhere else today," he'd said, his voice carefully controlled but his body language screaming alarm, every muscle tense like he was preparing to run or fight depending on which option presented itself first. When I asked why, he just shook his head and steered me toward the diner 3 blocks away, glancing over his shoulder twice before we'd walked half a block, moving like someone who expected to be followed but couldn't explain by whom or why. That's when he started checking our car every morning, a ritual that began with casual inspection of the tires and evolved into something more thorough and systematic, examining the undercarriage with his phone's flashlight, running his fingers along the wheel wells, popping the hood to scan the engine compartment with the methodical attention of someone looking for something specific. Maintenance, he'd explain if I asked, but mechanics don't usually inspect vehicles with the paranoid intensity of bomb squad technicians, and David's background checks on our Honda began lasting 15 minutes instead of 15 seconds. The route changes started next, David abandoning the familiar path to his job site in favor of increasingly complex alternatives that added 20 minutes to his commute and took him through neighborhoods we'd never seen before. He'd leave earlier each morning, claiming traffic concerns, but I started noticing how he'd pause at stop signs longer than necessary, how his eyes would dart between mirrors with the frequency of someone convinced he was being hunted. "Road construction," he'd say when I commented. But there was no construction on Miller's Canyon Road, just curves he'd navigated safely for 5 years until something made them feel dangerous. Sleep became elusive for both of us, though for different reasons. David would lie awake listening to sounds I couldn't hear, his body rigid with attention while I pretended to sleep beside him, both of us performing rest we weren't experiencing. Some nights he'd get up to check the locks multiple times, testing the deadbolt and chain with the quiet desperation of someone who'd lost faith in basic security measures, as if our apartment had suddenly become a fortress under siege by invisible enemies. His appetite disappeared gradually, meals turning into mechanical fuel stops where he'd push food around his plate while scanning our surroundings, always positioning himself to face the entrance of whatever restaurant we'd chosen, always sitting with his back to a wall in configurations that prioritized escape routes over comfort. "Just not that hungry," became his standard response, but men who work construction don't usually survive on coffee and nervous energy, and I watched him lose 15 pounds while gaining an edginess that made conversation feel like navigating a minefield. The phone calls to his supervisor increased, David finding excuses to check in multiple times per day, ostensibly about project details, but actually creating a paper trail of his whereabouts that seemed designed more for documentation than communication. He started texting me his location obsessively, arriving at job sites, leaving for lunch, heading home, as if he needed witnesses to his movements, proof of where he'd been in case someone questioned his timeline. Work clothes got checked and rechecked before he left each morning, pockets emptied and refilled with items he touched throughout the day like talismans, wallet, keys, phone, always in the same order, always verified multiple times with the ritualistic precision of someone trying to maintain control over increasingly uncontrollable circumstances. How long had Dad been planning this? How many weeks or months had my husband been sensing danger he couldn't identify, responding to threats he couldn't see but somehow knew were real? The decision came to me at 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in October, the digital clock's red numbers burning into my retinas while David slept fitfully beside me, his body twitching with dreams that made him mutter incomprehensible warnings to invisible threats. I'd been lying awake for 3 hours, cataloging every sound in our apartment building. Footsteps in the hallway above us, the hum of Mrs. Patterson's television through thin walls, the periodic groan of old pipes settling into silence, while my mind churned through weeks of accumulated evidence that something was fundamentally wrong with our lives. The darkness felt different that night, heavier somehow, pressing down on me with the weight of questions I'd been avoiding because the potential answers terrified me more than continued ignorance. David's paranoia wasn't random. Construction workers who'd survived a decade of job sites and heavy machinery didn't suddenly develop anxiety about routine commutes and familiar coffee shops without reason. Someone was watching us, following us, making my husband feel hunted in ways he couldn't articulate but couldn't ignore, and the only person with both motive and means to orchestrate that kind of surveillance was also the person who'd raised me to trust family above everything else. I slipped out of bed with practiced silence, bare feet finding the cool hardwood floors of our living room where moonlight streaming through Venetian blinds created prison bar shadows across walls that had once felt like sanctuary. Our apartment looked different in the darkness, smaller, more vulnerable, every window suddenly seeming like a potential breach point rather than a source of natural light. The idea of recording my own father should have felt like betrayal of the most fundamental kind, but standing there in my pajamas with my phone in my hand, I realized that betrayal had already occurred. I was just finally acknowledging its existence. The first recording was accidental, or at least that's what I told myself when Dad called at 11:30 that night, his voice carrying the kind of forced casualness that suggested he'd been drinking but trying to hide it. "Just wanted to check on you kids," he'd said, but the conversation quickly shifted to questions about David's work schedule, his current projects, whether he'd mentioned feeling unsafe or noticing anything unusual lately. My finger found the record button before I'd consciously decided to press it, some primitive instinct recognizing the predatory undertones beneath paternal concern and responding with the digital equivalent of gathering evidence for a trial I hoped would never come. "Has he been acting differently?" Dad had asked, and something in his tone, too eager, too interested in details that shouldn't matter to a father-in-law making casual conversation, made my stomach drop with the recognition that these weren't random questions born of genuine concern. He was fishing for information, probing for weaknesses, conducting reconnaissance disguised as family check-ins, and the realization that I'd been an unwitting accomplice in surveilling my own husband made me feel complicit in something I still couldn't fully understand. The second recording happened 3 nights later, another late call where Dad's questions became increasingly specific about David's routines, his favorite restaurants, his preferred routes to work, details that felt innocuous individually but formed a pattern that made my skin crawl when considered collectively. I sat in our darkened kitchen, phone pressed to my ear while the coffee maker's digital display cast blue light across countertops where David and I had shared thousands of meals, and I listened to my father inventory my husband's life with the methodical precision of someone building a case or planning an operation. Does he still take Route 34 through Miller's Canyon? The question hit me like a physical blow because those curves had been part of our weekly routine for years. A scenic drive to visit David's grandmother that had become one of our small shared traditions. Why would my father need to know about David's driving routes unless he intended to use that information for something I couldn't bear to imagine? That night, after Dad hung up, I sat staring at my phone for nearly an hour, thumb hovering over the delete button, while my conscience warred with my growing certainty that these conversations weren't expressions of parental interest but intelligence gathering for purposes I didn't want to acknowledge. The recordings felt like evidence of something criminal, but they were also proof of my father's true feelings about the man I'd married, documentation of malice disguised as concern that I could no longer pretend was merely overprotective behavior. By the fourth recording, I developed a system, phone positioned beside the landline, finger ready to hit record the moment I recognized Dad's number on caller ID, notepad nearby to jot down the most disturbing questions for later analysis. Our house became a surveillance operation with myself as both investigator and victim, gathering proof of threats against my marriage while trying to maintain the fiction that these calls were normal family communication rather than reconnaissance missions designed to destroy the life I'd built with someone my father had decided was my enemy. The call that changed everything came at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I almost missed it because David and I were sharing a bottle of wine on our couch, celebrating his promotion to site supervisor with takeout Chinese food and a romantic comedy that had us both laughing until my phone rang from the kitchen counter where I'd left it charging. "Let it go to voicemail," David suggested, his arm tightening around my shoulders in the possessive way that meant he didn't want to share me with the outside world, but something about the timing felt wrong. Dad never called during what he'd learned were our couple hours, the sacred space between dinner and bedtime when we deliberately ignored phones and emails and existed only for each other. I kissed David's cheek and padded to the kitchen, muscle memory guiding my thumb to the record button before I'd even glanced at the caller ID, the routine now automatic after 3 weeks of documenting conversations that grew more disturbing with each exchange. "Hi, Dad," I answered, settling into our breakfast nook while David paused the movie and started clearing our coffee table, his movements casual and content in ways that made what happened next feel like watching innocence die in real time. But the voice that responded wasn't speaking to me. Dad hadn't realized the call had connected, and I found myself eavesdropping on a conversation that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "Make it look like an accident," my father was saying to someone whose voice I didn't recognize, his tone carrying the cold efficiency of someone discussing a business transaction rather than planning something that would destroy multiple lives. "He's poisoning my daughter against me, turning her into someone I don't recognize. She used to tell me everything, and now she protects him like he's some kind of saint." The stranger's voice was harder to make out, gravelly and careful, but I caught fragments that made my hands shake so violently I nearly dropped the phone. Route 34 and Miller's Canyon and 25,000 spoken with the casual precision of someone quoting rates for services most people couldn't imagine needing. My father continued, his words becoming clearer as he apparently moved closer to his phone, unaware that his daughter was listening to him arrange her husband's murder with the same methodical attention he'd once used to plan birthday parties and Christmas mornings. "The target is David Parker, 29 years old, works construction, drives a blue Honda Civic. He leaves for work every morning at 7:15, takes the canyon road because it's faster than the highway." Target. The word hit me like a physical blow because it reduced my husband, the man who'd held my hair while I had food poisoning, who'd learned to make my grandmother's soup recipe when she died, who still opened car doors and brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, to nothing more than an object to be eliminated. David, who was probably wondering why I'd been gone so long, who might come looking for me at any moment with that concerned expression he got when he thought something was bothering me. "That stretch of road has some dangerous curves," the stranger observed, and I could hear the smile in his voice, the professional satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect solution to a problem he'd been hired to solve. "Accidents happen all the time up there, especially in winter when the roads get icy." Very sad, very believable. The grieving widow would never suspect her father-in-law had anything to do with such a tragic coincidence. Father-in-law. The casual way he said it, like my father's relationship to David was just another detail in a file rather than a sacred bond that should have meant protection instead of destruction, made a rise in my throat until I had to press my free hand against my mouth to keep from making sounds that would reveal my presence on the line. "She can't know it was anything but an accident," my father continued, and his voice carried genuine pain now, the anguish of someone who loved me enough to want to spare me the knowledge of what he was willing to do to keep me. "My daughter loved her mother too much to ever forgive me if she knew I'd taken another person she cares about. This has to look completely random, completely tragic, completely unavoidable." $25,000, they agreed, half up front and half after completion. Payment terms for ending a life discussed with the same matter-of-fact tone David and I used when planning our monthly budget or deciding whether we could afford dinner at the nice restaurant downtown. The professional asked about timeline, and my father suggested our anniversary week. She'll be distracted, emotional, thinking about celebration instead of suspicion. Perfect time for a tragic accident that everyone will blame on coincidence and bad weather. Our anniversary. The day we planned to celebrate 5 years of marriage. Dad wanted to turn into the day I became a widow, the day David's family would gather to mourn a son and grandson whose only crime had been loving someone whose father couldn't bear to share her affection. I sat frozen in our kitchen, listening to the two most important men in my life, one unknowingly humming along to movie credits in our living room, the other actively arranging the first one's death, while my world collapsed into a reality where love and murder could occupy the same conversation, the same heart, the same family. When they finally hung up, I remained motionless for several minutes, phone still pressed against my ear, recording silence while my mind struggled to process the impossibility of what I'd just heard, the father who taught me to trust family above everything else revealing himself as the greatest threat to the family I'd chosen for myself. The recording ended, but I remained frozen in our kitchen chair, phone still pressed against my ear like I could somehow rewind the last 8 minutes and hear different words, a different conversation, a different father planning a different anniversary gift instead of my husband's execution. The silence felt deafening after the horror of what I just documented, broken only by David's voice calling from the living room asking if everything was okay, his tone carrying the kind of casual concern that meant he assumed I was dealing with typical family drama rather than evidence of a murder conspiracy. "Just Dad being Dad." I called back, the lie tasting like acid on my tongue because nothing about this situation qualified as normal paternal behavior, and the ease with which deception rolled off my lips made me wonder if I was more my father's daughter than I'd ever wanted to acknowledge. My hands shook as I set the phone on our kitchen counter, the device now containing proof that the man who taught me to ride a bicycle and check my oil was actively planning to eliminate the person who taught me what healthy love actually looked like. David appeared in the doorway, concern etched across features that had become so familiar over 5 years of marriage that I could read his moods in the angle of his eyebrows, the set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when something was bothering him. Tonight, those shoulders carried tension that made perfect sense now. He'd been sensing danger because danger was real, stalking him with professional precision while he tried to protect a wife who'd unknowingly been feeding information to his would-be killer. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, crossing to me with the kind of careful movement that suggested he was prepared for bad news, maybe a death in the family or unexpected medical diagnosis, normal catastrophes that happen to regular people, rather than the surreal nightmare of discovering your father-in-law was literally a threat to your life. I stared at his face, memorizing details I'd looked at thousands of times but suddenly feared losing. The small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, The way his eyes crinkled when he was worried about me, the stubble he'd forgotten to shave that morning because he'd been running late after spending 15 minutes checking our car for tracking devices. Is this betrayal, or the ultimate protection? The question echoed through my mind as I wrestled with the impossibility of my situation. Saving my husband meant destroying my father. Protecting my marriage meant ending my relationship with the man who'd raised me. Choosing David meant accepting that everything I'd believed about family loyalty had been a lie designed to keep me controllable rather than safe. David knelt beside my chair, his hands finding mine with the automatic intimacy of someone who'd spent years learning to comfort me through various crises, but nothing in our relationship had prepared either of us for this particular brand of terror. His thumb found my wedding ring, spinning it gently around my finger in the absent gesture that had become his signature move when he was trying to ground me during emotional storms. But tonight the familiar comfort felt weighted with new meaning. That ring represented 5 years of choosing each other daily, 5 years of building something together that my father considered threatening enough to destroy, 5 years of love that someone was willing to kill for rather than simply accept. "Jessica, you're scaring me," David said softly, his voice carrying the kind of gentle authority that meant he wasn't going to let me deflect or minimize whatever was happening, the tone he used when he suspected I was protecting him from something he needed to know. "What did your father say that has you looking like the world just ended?" The world had ended, in a way. The world where my father was a flawed but fundamentally good man. The world where family meant safety rather than ownership. The world where the people who claimed to love me most would never hurt the person who made me happiest. I looked into David's eyes, those honest brown eyes that had never lied to me, never manipulated me, never tried to control me, and I realized that protecting him meant accepting that some betrayals were actually acts of love, that sometimes choosing someone means choosing against everyone else who demands your loyalty. My phone sat on the counter between us, containing evidence that would send my father to prison for conspiracy to commit murder, proof that would save my husband's life but destroy what remained of my family of origin. The weight of that choice pressed down on me like physical force, but looking at David's face, trusting, concerned, completely unaware that he'd been marked for death by someone who should have been celebrating his place in our family, made the decision simpler than it should have been. "I need to make a phone call," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt as I reached for my wedding ring with my free hand, spinning the bands around my finger while I gathered courage I didn't know I possessed. "And David, after I make this call, everything is going to change. Our life, our family, everything we thought we knew about the people who are supposed to protect us." He nodded without asking for details, trusting me to handle whatever crisis was unfolding, and that trust, absolute, unquestioning, the kind of faith that comes from years of being partners rather than adversaries, made my choice inevitable. Some people deserve protection more than others, and the man kneeling beside me, holding my hand while I prepared to shatter both our worlds, deserved protection more than the man who'd spent weeks planning his murder. The FBI field office number stared back at me from my laptop screen while David made coffee he didn't want, and I sat at our kitchen table clutching my phone like a weapon that could either save or destroy everything I'd ever loved. 304-555-0177. 10 digits that would transform me from devoted daughter to federal witness. 10 numbers that would turn a family conflict into a criminal investigation with consequences I couldn't begin to imagine. My wedding rings caught the overhead light as I positioned my finger over the first digit, the diamonds throwing tiny rainbows across our table surface in a display of beauty that felt obscenely cheerful considering I was about to destroy my father's life to save my husband's. David stood behind me, one hand resting gently on my shoulder while I navigated the impossible mathematics of betrayal. Was it worse to let my father murder my husband, or to send my father to federal prison for conspiracy to commit that murder? The answer should have been obvious. But 29 years of loving someone makes logic feel like cruelty, even when logic is the only thing standing between your marriage and a staged accident on Miller's Canyon Road. FBI Baltimore Field Office, Agent Rodriguez speaking. The voice was professional, female, carrying the kind of calm authority that suggested she'd handled stranger calls than the one she was about to receive from a suburban housewife whose father had hired a contract killer. I opened my mouth to speak, and found my voice trapped somewhere between my heart and my throat, paralyzed by the enormity of what I was about to set in motion. Investigations, arrests, Trials, prison sentences, family destruction, media coverage, the complete obliteration of everything I'd once believed about the people who were supposed to protect me. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Agent Rodriguez prompted, and I realized I'd been silent for nearly 30 seconds, breathing into the phone like a prank caller while my marriage and my father's freedom hung in the balance of my ability to form coherent sentences about impossible situations. David's hand squeezed my shoulder gently, a reminder that he was there, that this choice wasn't just about abstract concepts of right and wrong, but about protecting someone who'd spent 5 years proving he deserved protection. "My name is Jessica Parker," I said finally, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears, like someone else was speaking through my mouth while I watched from outside my own body. "I need to report a murder conspiracy. My father has hired someone to kill my husband." The words hung in the air between us, transforming our kitchen from a place where we'd shared thousands of meals into a crime scene where evidence was being reported, where normal life ended and federal investigation began. Agent Rodriguez's tone shifted immediately from routine professionalism to focused attention, the change so subtle that someone who hadn't been listening for it might have missed the way her breathing changed, the slight pause that meant she was reaching for a pen and possibly signaling to colleagues. "Mrs. Parker, I need you to stay exactly where you are and keep this line open. Are you in immediate danger? Is your husband with you right now?" The questions came rapid fire, trained responses designed to assess threat levels and coordinate response, but they also served to ground me in the reality of what was happening. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from, or a misunderstanding I could clarify with family conversation. This was a federal crime being reported by someone who possessed evidence that could result in decades of prison time for multiple people. "We're both safe right now," I managed, though safety felt relative when you just discovered that your father was actively planning your husband's death. "I have recordings." Phone conversations between my father and someone he hired. They discussed specific details, location, timing, payment method, everything. Agent Rodriguez began asking for specifics, and I found myself reciting information with mechanical precision, while my emotional self observed from a distance that felt protective and terrifying simultaneously. "Richard Parker, my father, 62 years old, address, phone number, employment history, no prior criminal record that I knew of. David Parker, my husband, his work schedule, the route he took to his job site, the reason my father considered him a threat worth eliminating. $25,000, half up front, half on completion. Miller's Canyon Road, the dangerous curves, the plan to make it look accidental. Anniversary week, when I'd be distracted and emotional. Mrs. Parker, I need you to save those recordings to a secure location and email copies to the address I'm about to give you. Do not discuss this conversation with anyone except your husband until we can arrange for agents to meet with you. Do you understand?" I understood that my life as I'd known it was over, that choosing David meant accepting that some bridges burn completely when you cross them, that loving someone enough to protect them sometimes means destroying the people who taught you what love was supposed to look like. My ring sparkled under the kitchen lights as I wrote down email addresses and case numbers, symbols of promises that had suddenly become worth defending against threats I'd never imagined facing. They arrested my father at his office on a Thursday morning while he was reviewing blueprints for a client's kitchen renovation, the same methodical attention to detail he'd once used to build my childhood treehouse, now focused on ordinary domestic projects that would never be completed. Agent Martinez called me at 11:15 to confirm the arrest had been made without incident, his voice professional but somehow gentler than I'd expected, as if he understood that federal justice often required personal devastation to achieve its goals. "Your father requested to speak with you," the agent said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't unusual. Criminals often wanted to confront the family members who'd turned them in, either to express rage or attempt manipulation, probably both. "We can arrange a supervised call if you're willing, but Mrs. Parker, I want you to understand that anything he says will likely be recorded for evidentiary purposes." The call came through at 2:30 that afternoon, David sitting beside me on our couch with his hand covering mine, both of us staring at the phone like it contained a bomb that might explode if we handled it incorrectly. When I answered, the first sound I heard wasn't my father's voice, but the hollow echo that comes with institutional phone systems, the kind of audio quality that immediately communicates isolation, confinement, the end of freedom as most people understand it. Jessica. His voice sounded smaller somehow, diminished by circumstances he'd never imagined facing, stripped of the authoritative tone that had defined my childhood and shaped my understanding of what paternal protection was supposed to sound like. They're telling me you made a recording. They're saying you turned in your own father. The disbelief in his words was genuine, raw with the kind of betrayal that comes from discovering that the person you thought you controlled completely had developed a moral compass that pointed away from family loyalty towards something he couldn't understand or forgive. I could hear him breathing through the phone, probably sitting in some sterile interrogation room surrounded by federal agents who saw him as just another criminal rather than the man who taught his daughter to change oil and check tire pressure, who'd attended every school play and graduation ceremony, who'd walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes. Dad, you hired someone to kill David. The words felt surreal even as I spoke them, like I was describing someone else's father rather than the man whose lap I'd fallen asleep on during countless Sunday afternoon movies. But the evidence was undeniable: recordings, financial transactions, detailed planning sessions that transformed love into something predatory and possessive. You were going to murder my husband on our anniversary and make me think it was an accident. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, long enough for me to wonder if he'd hung up or if the connection had failed, but finally he spoke with the kind of broken confusion that comes from realizing your worldview was fundamentally flawed. He was taking you away from me, Jessica. Every year you got further away, more loyal to him than to your family, more willing to choose his needs over mine. His voice carried genuine anguish, the pain of someone who'd watched his daughter grow into an independent woman and interpreted that growth as theft rather than natural development. I raised you, I protected you, I gave you everything you needed to be happy, and he just walked into your life and convinced you that wasn't enough anymore. The justification was breathtaking in its selfishness. This idea that his 29 years of fatherhood had purchased the right to dictate my adult relationships, that David's crime was loving me in ways that didn't center my father's ego or require his approval. You don't understand what real love looks like, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt because David was beside me, solid and warm and representing everything my father had tried to destroy. Real love doesn't require control. Real love doesn't murder people who make you happy. Real love lets you choose. Jessica, who are you really? The question came out like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, recognizing that the compliant daughter he'd raised had developed into someone capable of choosing justice over family loyalty, someone willing to protect her marriage even at the cost of sending her father to federal prison. I thought I knew you. I thought blood meant something to you. Blood did mean something to me, but not more than preventing murder, not more than protecting innocence, not more than defending the kind of love that builds rather than destroys. The man on the other end of his call had stopped being my father the moment he decided David's existence was a problem that required lethal solutions, the moment he transformed paternal protection into something predatory and controlling. You chose him over blood, he said finally, his voice hollow with the recognition that his little girl had grown into a woman whose moral compass pointed toward justice rather than unconditional family loyalty. After everything I did for you, everything I sacrificed to make you happy, you chose a stranger over your own father. David wasn't a stranger. He was the person who'd spent 5 years proving that love could exist without ownership, that protection didn't require control, that choosing someone every day was more meaningful than being bound to them by genetics and shared history. The FBI investigation revealed patterns I'd been too close to see, 29 years of manipulation disguised as protection that started before I was old enough to recognize red flags and continued until the day agents arrested my father for trying to purchase my husband's death. Agent Rodriguez spread the timeline across her desk during our second interview, documents and photographs that transformed my childhood memories into evidence of systematic control, each milestone of my development marked by increasingly invasive monitoring that I'd mistaken for devoted parental attention. The elementary school years, volunteering for every field trip, befriending my teachers, positioning himself as the helpful single father after Mom's death who needed to know everything about my daily activities for my own safety. What I'd remembered as dedication looked different through investigative eyes, excessive involvement designed to monitor my social development and identify potential threats to his exclusive relationship with his daughter. Middle school brought the first tracking devices, Disguised as safety measures after a child went missing in a neighboring town, my backpack equipped with GPS monitoring that he checked obsessively, my routes to and from school mapped with military precision. Normal parental concern. I'd thought then, grateful for a father who cared enough to worry, but the FBI's tech specialist showed me purchase records for surveillance equipment that went far beyond reasonable safety precautions. High school revealed phone monitoring software installed on devices I believe were private. Every text message and phone call documented and analyzed for signs that I might be developing loyalties that didn't center him. The dates on the surveillance reports correlated exactly with times I'd mentioned new friends or expressed interest in activities that didn't include him, pattern recognition software flagging normal teenage independence as threats requiring increased oversight. College represented an escalation phase. The monthly campus visits supported by private investigator reports about my social circle, academic performance, dating prospects, and extracurricular activities that painted a picture of someone conducting counterintelligence operations against his own daughter. Room assignments, class schedules, work-study positions, everything monitored and influenced through donations and relationships he'd cultivated specifically to maintain control over my environment even from 200 miles away. The private investigator, a former police detective named Kenneth Walsh, had kept meticulous records of his surveillance activities, apparently unaware that documenting his employer's obsession with controlling an adult daughter might someday become evidence in a federal murder conspiracy case. Photographs of me studying in the library, eating lunch with friends, walking to class, dating, laughing, my entire college experience documented like I was a subject under observation rather than a daughter living her life. Meeting David triggered what the investigators' reports called heightened concern protocols, surveillance intensifying dramatically once my father identified my boyfriend as a legitimate threat to his psychological ownership of his daughter. Financial records showed payments to Walsh increasing threefold during the months after I'd first mentioned David's name, background checks conducted on every member of his family, employment history investigated, character references interviewed under false pretenses. The agents showed me photographs I'd never known existed, pictures of David and me on dates, holding hands walking across campus, kissing outside coffee shops, completely unaware that someone was documenting our relationship's development for hostile purposes. Your father knew David's social security number, employment history, medical records, and financial information within 6 weeks of your first date, Agent Martinez explained, sliding a folder across his desk that contained more information about my husband than I'd learned during our first year together. He also conducted extensive interviews with David's previous girlfriends, roommates, professors, and employers, building a psychological profile that he used to identify weaknesses and pressure points. The wedding surveillance was the most disturbing revelation. Hidden cameras positioned throughout the venue to record not just the ceremony but private conversations between David and his family, my interactions with guests, moments that should have been sacred documented for analysis by someone who viewed my marriage as enemy intelligence gathering. Audio equipment had captured David's conversations with his best man, his parents' private comments about gaining a daughter, his grandmother's whispered prayers for our happiness. Intimate family moments weaponized by someone who saw love as a zero-sum competition he was losing. Post-wedding monitoring included tracking devices on both our cars, listening equipment installed in our apartment during routine maintenance, visits that my father had somehow arranged, financial surveillance of our bank accounts and credit cards that painted detailed pictures of our daily routines, spending habits, and life plans. The FBI's technical team had spent 3 days removing surveillance equipment from our home, devices so sophisticated that David and I had never suspected we were living in a fishbowl constructed by someone who believed monitoring was equivalent to loving. The escalation to murder for hire represents what behavioral analysts call extinction burst, Agent Rodriguez explained, her voice clinical but somehow gentle as she described how controlling people respond when traditional manipulation stops working. When your father realized that surveillance and psychological pressure weren't enough to separate you from David, he concluded that more extreme measures were necessary to regain control over what he considered his primary relationship. 29 years of my life, from birth to marriage to the moment I'd recorded him arranging David's death, documented and analyzed and revealed as something much darker than overprotective parenting. The prison visit happened 6 months after sentencing, federal correctional facility in Cumberland where my father was serving 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of murder, and multiple counts of stalking that the FBI had documented with devastating precision. I'd driven there alone despite David's offer to accompany me, knowing that some conversations require the kind of privacy that witnesses make impossible, even witnesses who love you enough to sit through your family's destruction. The visiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and disappointment, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across metal tables where families attempted to maintain connections that incarceration had fundamentally altered. Dad looked smaller in his prison uniform, diminished in ways that went beyond the 15 pounds he'd lost or the gray that had overtaken his hair. Something essential had been stripped away, the confidence that comes from controlling your environment and the people in it. "You look good, Jessica," he said when I sat across from him, his hands folded on the table between us in a gesture that seemed both submissive and careful, like he was still learning how to interact with his daughter as an equal rather than as property he'd temporarily misplaced. "Marriage agrees with you. You seem stronger somehow. More yourself." The observation surprised me, because it suggested awareness I hadn't expected from someone who'd spent decades seeing me as an extension of himself, rather than as an independent person with thoughts and feelings that didn't require his approval. Prison, apparently, had given him time to think about relationships he'd taken for granted, perspectives he'd never bothered to consider when controlling people felt easier than understanding them. "I've been going to therapy," he continued, his voice carrying the kind of humility that comes from having your worldview shattered by consequences you never thought you'd face. "Court-ordered initially, but I kept going because I needed to understand how I became someone capable of trying to murder my daughter's husband. That's not who I thought I was." The admission hung between us like a confession he'd been practicing for months, words that acknowledged not just criminal behavior but the psychological foundation that had made such behavior seem rational to someone who'd convinced himself that love justified any action, including violence against innocent people. We talked for nearly 2 hours, conversation meandering through territory we'd never explored before. His childhood with parents who'd shown love through control, his marriage to my mother, and the fear that had consumed him after her death. The way grief had transformed protectiveness into something possessive and ultimately destructive. "I thought losing your mother meant I had to hold on to you twice as tight," he said, his voice breaking with recognition of how fundamentally he'd misunderstood both love and loss. "I thought if I could control everything about your environment, I could prevent you from ever experiencing the kind of pain that comes from losing someone you can't live without. But controlling my environment had meant controlling me, and controlling me had meant denying me the right to choose my own relationships, make my own mistakes, develop into the kind of person who could love others without requiring ownership in return." His therapy had apparently helped him understand the difference between protection and possession, between love that nurtures independence and love that demands dependence. "I'm proud of you," he said finally, the words carrying weight I'd never heard from him before. Approval that wasn't contingent on my compliance or conditional on my choosing his preferences over my own judgment. "You chose what was right even when it meant losing your father. That took courage I didn't know you had. Strength I never taught you because I was too busy trying to make you need me." The conversation revealed that prison had given him something he'd never possessed as a free man, the ability to see me as separate from himself, to recognize that healthy relationships require boundaries rather than eliminate them, to understand that love grows stronger when it's chosen rather than demanded. "Some bonds must be broken to save love," I told him, reaching across the table to touch his hand for the first time since his arrest, physical contact that felt different now that it came from choice rather than obligation. "Breaking the bond that made you think you own me, save the bond that makes us family. I couldn't be your daughter as long as you needed me to be your possession." He nodded with understanding that seemed genuine, hard-earned through months of therapy sessions and sleepless nights confronting the reality of what he'd become when fear masqueraded as love, when protection became predation, when devotion transformed into something destructive enough to plan murder. We both had learned lessons that changed us fundamentally. He'd learned that love requires letting go, and I'd learned that sometimes protecting the people you love means disappointing the people who raised you. Neither lesson came easily, but both were necessary for us to become the kind of people capable of healthy relationships. Prison had taught him humility. Marriage had taught me boundaries. His consequences had forced growth. My choices had demanded courage. We both discovered that family love doesn't have to be unconditional to be real, that setting limits doesn't mean caring less, that choosing partners doesn't require abandoning parents, as long as parents can accept that their children's lives belong to their children rather than to them. 3 years later, David and I bought our house on Elm Street with the insurance settlement from my father's surveillance equipment removal and the emotional damages awarded by the federal court, turning the financial remnants of a murder conspiracy into the foundation for a life built on trust rather than control. The kitchen windows face east, so morning sunlight streams across our breakfast table where we share coffee and newspaper sections, and the comfortable silence that comes from knowing someone loves you enough to let you exist without constant supervision or manufactured drama. Our guest bedroom remains empty most of the time, but we furnished it hopefully because both forgiveness and family relationships require space to grow into something healthier than they were before. Crisis forced everyone involved to examine what love actually means versus what control masquerades as when people mistake possessiveness for devotion. The protection we all deserve isn't the kind that monitors our phone calls or tracks our movements or attempts to eliminate people who make us happy in ways that don't center the protector's ego. Real protection creates safe spaces for growth, establishes boundaries that nurture independence rather than enforce dependence, and recognizes that loving someone means wanting their happiness even when that happiness doesn't revolve around your needs or validate your importance in their lives. David learned to trust his instincts about danger after months of therapy helped him understand that his paranoia during those final weeks had been entirely justified, that feeling watched and threatened hadn't been anxiety disorder but accurate assessment of a situation where someone actually was planning his death. His construction work now includes installing security systems for domestic violence survivors, practical skills applied to helping people protect themselves from the kind of controlling love that becomes lethal when it can't maintain ownership over its target. My father serves his sentence with what prison counselors call genuine remorse, participating in therapy programs designed to help violent offenders understand the psychology behind their crimes and develop healthier relationship patterns for eventual reintegration into society. His letters arrive monthly now, correspondence that focuses on taking responsibility rather than seeking forgiveness, acknowledging harm rather than minimizing consequences, demonstrating the kind of personal growth that punishment sometimes catalyzes when people are finally forced to confront the reality of who they became when love twisted into something unrecognizable. The FBI case files remain sealed, but Agent Rodriguez occasionally updates me on related investigations that my father's cooperation has assisted. Other families where surveillance and control escalated toward violence. Other daughters whose protection required exposing fathers who confused ownership with love. Apparently, my willingness to record and report family members engaged in criminal behavior helped establish precedents for prosecuting domestic surveillance cases that previously fell through legal cracks. What love in your life deserves protection? The question echoes through everything I've learned about relationships since that terrible anniversary when I discovered that the person who taught me to trust family was the same person planning to destroy the family I'd chosen. David's love deserved protection because it asked nothing of me except presence, demanded no proof of loyalty except daily choice, required no sacrifice of other relationships to validate its importance in my life. My mother's memory deserved protection from being weaponized by someone who claimed grief justified controlling behavior, her legacy honored through relationships based on mutual respect rather than emotional manipulation disguised as devotion. My own worth deserved protection from people who measure my value by compliance with their expectations rather than recognition of my inherent right to make choices about my own life, even when those choices disappointed people who believed they'd earned ownership through years of investment in my development. The children David and I hope to have someday will deserve protection that teaches them the difference between love and control, relationships that model healthy boundaries rather than possessive attachment, family dynamics where loyalty is earned through respect rather than demanded through guilt and manipulation. Every person reading this story deserves relationships where protection means creating safety for growth rather than eliminating threats to ego, where love expresses itself through support for independent choices rather than punishment for choosing differently than controllers prefer. We all carry worth that exists independent of other people's ability to recognize or validate it. Value that doesn't require anyone else's approval to be real and meaningful and worthy of protection from those who would destroy it rather than celebrate it. If after hearing my story you feel there's someone in your life trying to control your happiness, don't wait until it becomes dangerous. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting your love? What relationships do you think deserve our ultimate protection? And don't forget to tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing where my Strong Women family is located around the world. Sometimes the greatest love requires the greatest courage, and sometimes protecting what matters most means disappointing people who mistake their fear for your safety, their need for your obligation, their love for their right to control your life. Don't forget to subscribe, because this daughter has many more stories about choosing love over fear, growth over control, protection over possession.